Okay, good evening everyone, and a warm welcome to all of you. My name is Ryan Neelam. I'm the Director of the Public Opinion and Foreign Policy Program at the Lowy Institute, and I'm the author of the 2023 Lowy Institute Poll. I want to acknowledge that we're gathering here on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay out my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. A bit of background on the Lowy Institute poll. I've just joined the Institute. This is the first poll I've delivered in my capacity here, and it's a fantastic product that goes back 19 years. The poll was started to create a bridge between policymakers in the foreign policy, trade and international field and the public and what people think about foreign and trade and development policy. We wanted to connect those two spheres so that there was an understanding of Australian attitudes to the world. In a sense, the poll was created to democratise foreign policy making. And 19 years later, when we look back at the large trove of data we've accumulated over that time, we see how the understanding Australian views towards the world and how they see their place in it has shaped the debate around foreign policy and how it's moved policy in some areas. But of course, it's understanding public opinion is only one input into a wide range of other equities that policymakers must balance. But our view is that it must be understood, and then it is up to policymakers to judge how to use it. I'm delighted today to be joined by an all-star cast of panelists. To my left is Damien Cave, an award-winning journalist with the New York Times. Is the Australia Bureau Chief for the New York Times, and has previously served in Miami as the chief of that bureau, as well as covering Mexico, Central America and the Caribbean. He was also in Baghdad from 2006 to 2007 and was among a group of finalists for the 2008 Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting. Next to Damien, to his left is Dr. Meg Keane, the Director of the Pacific Islands program at the Lowy Institute. She was the inaugural director of the Australia Pacific Security College, a senior analyst at the Office for National Intelligence, and a program leader with RAMSI, the Regional Assistance Mission to the Solomon Islands. Her work on the Pacific spans decades across academia, intelligence and policymaking. And last but not least is the Lowy Institute's very own Director of Research, Hervé Lemaiu. Hervé is the creator of the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index, which maps the changing distribution of power across the region. And his research spans Australian foreign policy, global governance, and Southeast Asia. He's also a consulting senior fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore. Now, I want to dive right in because we have a lot of ground to cover. For those of you that are familiar with the Lowy Institute poll, you know that it spans basically the world. And of course, in the last 3 years, we've seen such a turbulent time in international affairs, as well as Australia's place in the world. We've seen the effects of a global pandemic, Australia's fractious relationship with China, our largest trading partner, as well as Russia's brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine. But in 2023, we see things reaching a different stage in many of those indicators, and some of the issues that I mentioned which have impacted on Australians' attitudes have started to change. I want to start, however, with a point of continuity across the 19 years of the Lowy Institute poll's history, and that is attitudes towards the US and the US alliance. More Australians currently trust the US than under President Biden than under President Trump. More Australians have confidence in President Biden himself, and the US and over 3/4 of Australians see the US as globally respected. One of the most consistent points of Lowy Institute polling has been the view that ANZUS, Australia's alliance with the United States, is important to Australia's security. However, when you scratch under the surface, we also see that 3/4 of Australians say that the alliance makes it more likely that Australia will be drawn into a war in Asia that is not in our interests. So there's a really interesting duality there. And I want to start with you, Damien. If you could give us a sense of how you interpret that apparent contradiction between feeling safer with the United States yet also seeing more risk as part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the poll kind of shows is a degree of kind of uncertainty in decision making within the Australian public. There's a desire to be very close to the United States, a desire for that alliance to work as well as it has in the past. But like you see throughout the rest of the region, there's a growing degree of concern about what that means when you have American dysfunction and its own politics as great as it is, when you have concerns about which America you're going to get. Are you going to get the Biden America or the Trump America? It's only natural for Australians to start to question, well, what does this sort of lead to in the coming years? And this is something I think you're seeing throughout the region, throughout the Indo-Pacific. There are growing concerns about both great powers. Both China and the United States look increasingly unpredictable and their role in the world and their own contests against each other. And I think Australians are just smartly pragmatic in looking at this and saying, okay, this is still our best bet, but we better be careful and hedge our bets perhaps as we go forward.
Mm. And in terms of the view of the US and its staying power in the region, you mentioned that there was perhaps differences in how they saw the US under Trump to Biden. One of the interesting results this year, we asked a question about how Australians see the power relativities between the United States and their views of whether the US will become more important and powerful in the future, and also the same question about the Chinese, about China, whether that will what its power will look like in the future. 61% said that they see China playing a more important and powerful role in the future, whereas only 22% said that they saw the US playing a more important and powerful role. However, 45% of Australians also said that they expected US power and influence to stay the same. So Meg, could I get your perspective on that? I mean, what does that tell us about how Australians view the United States as a global power and one that is in our region?
Just wondering if anybody caught all those statistics and could repeat them for me. I think Australia, like the Pacific Island countries where I do a lot of my work, there's a bit of a wait and see what's going to happen here. This is not the first time we've seen a pivot happen or a pronounced pivot happen, and we saw that in 2011-12. And the Pacific, it was going to be part of that pivot, and they are feeling, how's this going to manifest itself? What's really going to happen? Is there staying power with this? And what is it going to look like? Is this going to be very much about security and defense? Or is it going to be what I think many would like to see it, is about economic opportunity, about trade, about democracy and social development? And I know in the Pacific, that's the preferred way this would evolve. And it's not entirely clear. The focus has been very much on security up to now. Mm-hmm. And it is also not entirely clear, as Damien was saying, is if there are political changes, will this commitment sustain itself, particularly if we ended up with Trump again?
And there's a fair bit of risk if you're over-investing on the security side, then the volatility that comes from American politics makes that even riskier too. If that's a hammer, who's going to decide what to use that hammer, and does everything become a nail? And I do think that throughout the region, and Australia reflects this too, but it's even more apparent in other countries that are close economic partners to the United States too, is this desire for the United States to not just bring the hammer. Yeah. And you know, you've had a country that in that first pivot was talking about free trade. America's had a lot of questions about whether or not free trade is the answer in terms of its foreign policy. There are a lot of questions and doubts about what role the United States wants to play economically in the region. And so, you know, the Pacific Islands is leading in many ways that question of the United States, which I also hear around the region. But I think you see that in the poll too. There's an apprehensiveness about the security piece, about is the United States going to drag us to war? And so even as the United States sees Australia as its best friend in the region, and I think in some ways the poll also reflects that. Australians are showing the Americans why the Americans are so invested in Australia, because Australians want to believe the best of America, even if all the facts might point them in the other direction. And so, you know, this idea that the alliance is the most important thing is an Australian commitment to stay with the United States as long as possible in a way that, frankly, a lot of other countries in the region are starting to maybe have some doubts. You'll hear it in the political conversations that I'm sure Meg is having, that I'm hearing in Singapore and in Japan and in other places, where there's a sense that not necessarily that America is in decline, but the world is changing. It's not just that China is rising, India is rising, Japan is totally changing its posture in the region. Australia is also changing its defense posture. So you're living in a world where the old sort of balances that used to be there are no longer there. And Australia, like a lot of countries, is trying to figure out, well, what the hell do we do? If this is not the same world that it was 5-10 years ago, what do we do now? And I think the poll reflects that.
Hervé?
Yeah, it's interesting what Damon's saying, because if you track the poll across 19 years, support for individual US presidents has sort of varied somewhat. And in fact, I think one of your findings, Ryan, is that there's greater support, there tends to be, for Democratic administrations over Republican administrations. But nevertheless, the support for the alliance, almost as an institution unto itself, has remained rock solid across 19 years. And the reason that's interesting is that the point you're making is that look, this could actually be a political risk for Australia, because if all the US brings is the hammer to this region and it's abandoned the economic peace, then you could become embroiled in something that you don't want to as an ally of the United States. Nevertheless, I think Australians have always, rightly or wrongly, and I suppose that will be proven in time, perhaps, seen the alliance as something that stands above politics, that keeps us safe, and that is almost immune from the political turmoil of the United States. And there's a really interesting, in the critical threats, which I'm sure we might get to at some point, Ryan, but the second to last critical threat is actually US political instability. Now, I would argue that that's too low.
Yeah.
And that a lot of Americans would see that as too low. They would be more alarmed with their own political instability domestically. Now, that still amounts to about 1 in 3 Australians who see political instability in the US as a critical threat to Australia. But I think it emerges out of this conviction that the alliance is immune from come what may in US politics.
I also wonder if it's because Australians feel especially vulnerable, and that there's a desire to hold on to that alliance because, as Alan Gingell and others have sort of said, there's this fear of abandonment. And so, you're going to hold on as hard as much as you can, even if you're not so sure that that's the best option, because that's the option you've got.
Well, it's the only option.
Yeah, exactly.
But you do have the problem in a multipolar world. If your alliance is being exclusionary and provocative, and this is certainly in the Pacific, are you inviting a militarization of the region? Are you inviting an increase in the tension? So it's how you manage that alliance, and is it making us safer or isn't it? And I think that's the concern outside of our little realm.
No, I agree. That's the big debate. But there are those who argue that, for example, AUKUS is an anchoring point for the United States. It's actually us trying to keep them here because staying power is another big question mark, right?
Right.
And that it's not only that, it's not, we tend to see it as to the extent that there's criticism of AUKUS, it's framed in terms of this actually subtracts from our sovereignty. But you could also pitch it in the other direction and say this is our opportunity to gain influence in DC, to use AUKUS to try to shape the kind of superpower the United States is in this region.
Might be very optimistic about how all
I want to stay with AUKUS actually, because we did have some interesting results on that this year. 67% of Australians said that they support the deal for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, and that hasn't changed significantly from last year. And that's still a large majority saying that they're comfortable with this idea of acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. But we then went further and we asked more detailed questions about how Australians think those submarines will impact on regional stability or impact on the risk of war in the region. And the answer was a lot less clear. You had people saying that it would increase the risk of war, decrease it, a large number saying that they think it would make no difference, and a large number who were not sure. So it was a much more spread out, diffuse set of opinions when it comes to that. And then on the question of cost, almost half of the Australian public think that the cost is not worth the capability. So there's I find the nuances fascinating here, but how do we interpret that on the one hand, Australians are happy to see this deal take place, but on the other, they're unsure about the impact and they don't really think it's worth the cost. What do you think? Let's start.
I was laughing because I was thinking I was like, so if you sum it up, what it means is that Australians think, 1, it's too expensive. 2, it might not make us safe. But 3, we're totally in. Right? And so I do think that speaks to Hervé's point that this is actually not about submarines, and it's actually not about cost. It's about a deeper level of national insecurity and a desire to hold on to that American alliance until 2054 or however long it takes to get the damn submarines and the rest of it that comes with it. I also wonder, though, if there's a little bit of a deeper understanding among Australians, maybe sometimes we don't give them enough credit, where it's never just been about submarines. Like if you actually look closely at AUKUS, the second pillar in the long run is perhaps just as important, if not more important, and that's about technology and AI and a whole bunch of other things that Australia knows it needs to develop for both security and economic reasons. And so it's quite possible that, Australians are also recognizing this is a long-term bet, and that, yes, it's really expensive and may or may not make us safe, but that's not the only benefit.
And they're wanting to know what the benefit is going to be beyond security. Right. Is it going to be jobs? Is it going to be technological transfer? Is it going to be know-how? And are we going to be any more part of that big boy club than we were in the past? And I think those things are uncertain, which is why I think you get variable responses and maybe not a clear line of sight yet, because there's so much we don't know about.
Well, I'm going to be a slightly less flattering than Megan and Damien about what the average Australian thinks about AUKUS, because those are very sophisticated readings of those sort of mixed results. I mean, the way I read it was the announcements have had an impact. The big political set piece announcements initially under Scott Morrison, then under Prime Minister Albanese. But Australians actually don't have very many details about what AUKUS is. And so once you start scratching the surface beyond the political statements, they don't know, or they're unsure. And the link between acquiring nuclear submarines and a more stable, secure region is, I think, even more abstract. You could say it's in defense of Australia in the case of war, but how deterrence then contributes to a balance of power, which then contributes to stability and the creation of peace. I mean, that is a very abstract concept, and I'm not sure that most Australians are on board. And then you add defense costs on top of that, it suggests that politicians are going to have probably a slightly more turbulent time continuing to make the case for AUKUS. The more real and the more complex, inevitably, a project of this scale becomes.
And the timelines, right? The timelines, 40 years out. Who knows what's going to be a useful piece of technology and what the nature of war would be at that time. So there's a lot.
I think it's also worth making the point that we had, when we went to field, the San Diego announcement on the pathway to acquire the submarines had just taken place. So there was wall-to-wall coverage in media about the announcement, but the details were really fresh. You'd only just heard about the cost. And then it became there was one might say, a robust debate about that, starting at the National Press Club and continuing on from there. But it's really just the beginnings of the debate about the detail. And as you say, I think Australians are just coming to grips with what this means and how it plays out.
The only thing I would too is I wonder too how much part of it is Australia being told you're our really best friend maybe in the world. Like there's only a handful of countries that have this technology, and Australians like to be told you're the most important ally of the United States. And I also think that means, but that also has the potential to have real world impact in the region, where when you've got countries like South Korea and Japan that are very close ties to the United States also trying to hold the United States in the region, for them to see that, this is being done in Australia, one, that means the US is committed to the region, but also that raises Australia's stature within this group of countries that are also pushing on some of the same things. So I do think it has the potential to actually push Australia out into the world in a geopolitical way that hasn't been fully explored yet, and that may actually emerge as the largest impact of the deal.
Well, that's fascinating. There's a lot of different interpretations on one result there, so it just shows the complexity of polling. Another area which I'm sure will draw a lot of different interpretations, but China. This is one of the major shifts we've seen this year. From 2020, we saw a sharp decline in how Australians perceive China in the context of a relationship that really soured, as well as the range of measures that Beijing put in place against Australian trade, and a freezing of ministerial contact between Australia and China. Now, in 2023, things appear to have changed as the bilateral relationship between Australia and China has stabilised. We also see public opinion levelling off, or at least that decline has not continued. It's now flattened. And what you see here on this particular chart is the question of whether Australians see China as more of an economic partner or as more of a security threat. You can see that in 2020, more Australians saw Australia through the prism of economic partnership. And then that view flipped, and the dominant view in 2021 onwards was China was more of a security threat. Almost 2/3 of Australians thought that. Now, in 2023, this year, more Australians see China as an economic partner, and less Australians see China as a security threat. Hervé, I wanted to come to you on this to start off the debate about China, but thinking about this change in trajectory, do you see this as a turning point in the way Australians conceptualize or think about China, or is it the beginning, or is it the new normal?
I think it's certainly significant because it was 2 years ago that we seemed to have crossed the Rubicon. The China debate was settled, and basically the security prism won out over the economic prism, which was accused of being overly naive, and in the end, everything seemed to suggest that we were wrong. The campaign of economic coercion, what we're now calling the punitive trade measures or trade blockages, et cetera, the pandemic, the total deterioration in Chinese bilateral ties. So we seem to have crossed the Rubicon. I mean, that's certainly how the last government took it. And yet, both the data point here, which suggests there was already a leveling taking place last year, right? So at this point, we're looking at 2021 to 2022. So there was a sort of leveling off of that free fall in attitudes, the deteriorating attitudes towards China. Perhaps the last government should have seen the direction in which public attitudes were going, because I think it's now commonly accepted by professionals in both political parties that the China card, the China threat card, was overplayed and over-leveraged in a way that backfired for the last government. This government has brought in a new rhetoric. In substance, not all that much has changed, but certainly they deserve credit for being far more disciplined. And of course, what they're saying is this is really not about domestic politics. This is about foreign policy. Foreign policy, by the way, which ought to be bipartisan. And you see that both sides of the House are now broadly in tune with that. And it's a 10% uptick. It's 33 to 44%. It's now looking like the two, ways of viewing China, like the question of whether China is an economic opportunity more so than a security threat, hangs in the balance again. We're almost back to where we began. Now, I think you shouldn't overstate that. There is still, in net, more Australians who believe China to be a security threat than an economic opportunity. That's saying something. We're still a long way away from where we were 3 years ago, even in terms of more Australians viewing it as an economic opportunity. But it certainly suggests a pregnant pause. I think, it's sort of we're at the way station towards something, and it could be that we've, probably in the most optimistic assessment, found a new settling point. I think that's way too soon to tell and probably too optimistic. I think it's more of a fragile truce where we're trying to establish a workman-like relationship whereby we can have warm trade ties and basically cold political ties. But there's a lot, as my colleague Richard McGregor pointed out in a column for the AFR 2 weeks ago, that could still go wrong. And not all of those things that could go wrong are in the court of Australia or even belong to the bilateral relationship. I mean, there could be an altercation on the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea. There are any number of issues that could still derail this fragile truce.
So you see this as a new settling point, perhaps not necessarily the start of a rebound in the way Australians look at China.
I think it's a pregnant pause. It's a ... to be seen. And I think the Australian public here has given almost the benefit of the doubt in terms of revisiting this question.
Yeah.
not quite, but they're basically coming back to a point where this question hangs in the balance in a way that only 3 years ago we thought was settled for good.
Well, let me just bring in some other results on China. When it comes to trust, the level of trust towards China is 15% this year compared to over 50% just 5 years ago. And when we look at the military, the prospective military threat of China, Australians still see a lot of risk. 3/4 of Australians this year said that they see China as likely to become a military threat to Australia in the next 2 decades. And that hasn't changed year on year. So that perhaps speaks to a sense that there is a ongoing perception of risk in the longer term particularly, but that in the shorter term, there's a little bit more pragmatism. There's a sense and a reflection of the changing mood in the relationship from where it has been in the past few years. Now, Damien, you've been looking at how other countries also perceive China. How does this result look to you in the context of what the rest of the world or what other countries think about China?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, I think, to your point of whether this is an inflection point is, I mean, basically what it's saying, what Australians are saying is China is both a security threat and an economic opportunity. And which scale of those rises or falls will depend on the circumstances at hand. And I think a lot of other countries in the world are struggling with that combination too. You've never had a great power that is seen as both such an enormous security threat that is so intertwined, tightly intertwined into every other country's economies. And so this is a really thorny problem that's different. But I think a lot of countries have similar levels of frustration with China. I mean, when you look at, there was a poll that Pew did in September that basically found that across the developed world, the favorability or unfavorability ratings for China were in the 70s and 80s. In the US, I think it was 82%. And Japan, I think, was 87%. And so Australia is actually in line with a lot of these countries that are very, very concerned about China and see China in a very unfavorable way. So I think in this respect, Australia fits in generally with a lot of other countries in this position. But what's interesting is it's also with countries that in some ways are more directly threatened by China, one could argue, whether it's Japan, which is more likely to be dragged into a war with Taiwan than Australia would likely be, but just simply because of geography. Or, I'm trying to think of some of the other countries that were very high up, or the US, which is also very high because of its own great power dynamics with China and competition and the way the politics works in the United States. So Australia is placing itself in that camp of the extremely concerned, I think is what I would say.
And I think what pervasing is it's dynamic, right?
We're
seeing how it unfolds. But I also think we have to be careful about not extrapolating too far. And I think if we went to somewhere like the Pacific Island countries, many developing countries, they still see China as more as an opportunity than a threat. And so in the words of the past Secretary General, if you wanted one word to sum up how Pacific Island countries see China, it's access. Access to investment, access to the BRI, the Belt and Road, to aid programs, and they're hoping business and a different aid model. And then if you look at what actually happens is China comes into the region, aid to the Pacific Island countries has never been higher in its history. So the geopolitical competition has brought in finances, and as well, they have more access to loans. And there's all sorts of threats with that. And you have to be very careful with an area like the Pacific Island countries. It's sort of 21 different countries and territories. There is no one story here. But if you were to say a dominant one, and in many places in developing countries, they would see this as another opportunity. I have your cake and eat it too. It's not a rejection of the United States, not a direct rejection of Australia. It's just more resources. They're happy for it.
And it's not just the Pacific too. I mean, Brazil, Turkey, a lot of the sort of developing countries, Africa, in the so-called global South that view China in this way. But I also think that's starting to change too for a lot of countries.
Well, I was going to say that, and we see this in the Pacific. And we just did a podcast last week, a Lowy podcast that we put out with the opposition leader, one of them in Solomon Islands, Peter Kenaloria. He made it very clear that there are risks here. There's risks of political instability, the way that China does some of its financing direct to MPs, and therefore plays into a political process. There's risks to resources and how they may be exploited and used. And there's even risks in the way some of this investment is being manifested in developing countries and whether they can maintain it. Then in the Northern Pacific, you had the outgoing president of FSM, the Federated States of Micronesia, absolutely sent a bomb across the world, but in the region saying, be aware, this is politically destabilizing. It's not good in the gray zone activities. There's transnational crime involved in this. And the whole deal that Solomon Islands did with China is threatening to unseat or unbalance the security arrangements in the region. So be very, very careful. And there isn't one voice. There isn't one analysis. There's no one correct view.
As you were saying, look, I mean, and bringing it back to the Australian public opinion, the idea was that Australia was a bellwether, at least in the West, for this kind of deteriorating attitudes towards China, viewing it predominantly through a security threat and basically no longer through the land of economic opportunity. And yet the question now is, will it be a bellwether in the other direction? We only thought it was one-way traffic. Yeah. Right? Basically, we only thought it would stay the same or get worse in terms of deteriorating attitudes, in terms of seeing China as a security threat. The fact that this mini reversal, it's too strong a word to say reversal, but this flatlining and partial recovery in attitudes towards China has occurred at all just goes so against the grain of the global trend, or at least the Western trend towards attitudes, and perhaps some of these trends that we're now picking up in the Pacific. So Australia's always been ahead of the pack on this question, and it'll be interesting to see whether other.
I mean, you could argue it's still ahead of the pack, even with Germany, France, and some parts of Europe. I think are probably having a similar trajectory since that poll from Pew and the end of 22.
I want to move on to the risk of conflict, because that was another thing that got a lot of focus in the media when we released this poll. 2/3 of Australians see Taiwan, military conflict over Taiwan, as a critical threat to Australia's interests. Now that has risen extremely sharply from 5 years ago, where only 35% of Australians saw the same issue as a critical threat. So almost 2/3 now. When we drill down into how Australians would react to a conflict over Taiwan, a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan, let's say, large numbers of Australians are very comfortable with the idea of accepting Taiwanese refugees into Australia. Similarly, large numbers about sending military aid and imposing sanctions on Beijing if it were to take military action. And 6 in 10 Australians also say that they would be willing to use the Australian Navy to help the US prevent a blockade of Taiwan. I find that perhaps the most interesting result. But a majority were against the idea of sending Australian troops in to defend Taiwan. So on the one hand, you have a certain cautiousness about Australia, playing Australia directly into a conflict. On the other, there's a willingness to use the Australian Navy to help prevent a blockade, which, to my mind at least, has some pretty clear risks about a potential direct confrontation between Australian forces and China. Damien, how do you read that? Is it a contradiction, or is there a way to rationalize that?
I mean, I think there is a way to rationalize it. I think that the first thing I would say is that this reflects the broader topic that we've been discussing about Australian apprehension, about not being quite so sure how involved it wants to get in the giant mess that could be started between great powers over Taiwan. That's the first thing. The second thing, though, I think this is a reflection that, again, I hear throughout the region about the specific role of the maritime domain. I did a story recently about how Coast Guards throughout the region are just arming up and existing in this gray zone place that started with China launching these huge Coast Guard ships and using them to project power. Now Coast Guards throughout the region are doing the same. And there's this idea that in the maritime space, there's a lot of stuff that happens that isn't quite war and isn't quite law enforcement. And so what I think you see Australians trying to figure out a way to do is thread that needle and say, okay, well, if it's a Navy ship, yes, that's a warship. But if it's to prevent a blockade, well, that's about maybe economics and humanitarian aid. And so there's some way to try and find a moderate space in there. And it is really messy. I mean, I think that is a much higher risk proposition than maybe Australians recognize. But I also think what's interesting in that result is the agreement, the idea that Australians would support sanctions. Because what I hear from some large mining companies in Australia that make a shit ton of money from China, just to be blunt, is they're asking questions of experts. Well, let's see, if there are sanctions, does that mean I can't sell to China or not? And so I think there are going to be really, really difficult questions for Australia about sanctions that I think would actually precede anything having to do with the Navy.
And is some of this just about wanting to avoid the conflict, not be in the conflict, to be part of the solution, the mediation, and avoid the conflict? Because in a sense, what people fear more than China is they fear the conflict between U.S. and China. That is the biggest fear, and what can be avoided.
Yes and no. I mean, the point is that they're neutral. I mean, so majority of Australians would rather remain neutral in the event of a U.S.-China conflict if posed in that way.
56%.
But this suggests that there are intrinsic reasons why Australia may get involved in Taiwan, other than, let's help out our US partners because they're our allies. This suggests that there is something that resonates among Australians about, democracy being under military siege. It's not unlike the kind of support we see for Ukraine, and it could be that Australians are thinking about Ukraine when they're answering this question, and perhaps they haven't factored in that the costs, for this would be much steeper on Australia than anything we've done for Ukraine.
Or building on Damien's point, is it about a rules-based order, and you don't want blockades happening on a major shipping route.
Right.
And so you need, at that point, you have to take action not only because of the military conflict, but because of the threat to economy.
Right, that's possible.
Let's go back to the Pacific, and I want to stay with you, Meg. One of the results was that Australians remain concerned about a Chinese military base in the Pacific. We saw that skyrocket in previous polls, and it stayed at 87%. But the strength of that concern has ebbed. You touched on before that you don't think the Pacific Island countries don't necessarily see the same level of threat, or they have a different way of balancing the threat economy picture when it comes to China. How do you see this concern from Australians about a potential military base in the Pacific? Is that something in your work in the Pacific that you see anxieties being expressed amongst Pacific Island nations?
I think what would be interesting is exactly when your poll occurred, because we've had the Prime Minister of PNG, of Fiji, even Solomon Islands, Kiribati, Vanuatu say there is going to be no military base here. And if you actually look at what happens, even in Solomon Island, where the fear was high, it didn't matter whether it was in Tulagi or Malaita or Kulumbangara on an outer island, it gets stopped. The people are still very much, it's customary land ownership, customary ocean ownership. They don't want a Chinese base there. We had an address by the Prime Minister of Samoa, Viame, and she made the point that worry about dual use by all means, as the Chinese are involved in upgrading ports or even establishing new ports. And they may be used for commerce, but also military purposes. But that is not a military base. So I would imagine next year, I don't know, but there might be a decrease. They're still worried about what China's doing there and their security operations and surveillance and cyber and all sorts of things. But the military base, I think, is a long way off. But there was so much coverage of it for a period. And that's what brought the United States into Solomon Islands. That red line, got to stop this. This cannot happen. And it was feeling like it was imminent. They were going to have a base here in the Pacific. I think there's less of that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the question is also partially flawed because, as you're saying, it's really about access. And what you have in the Pacific is the United States and China scrambling all over the Pacific and all over the region to acquire access. And not just in the Pacific, it's in South Asia too. So the United States is making deals in Palau and in lots of other places that are looking for dual use as well. They're expanding airports. They're offering deals to improve ports. It's very similar. And so the question is, when that warship or that plane wants to land in the course of a conflict and there's missiles flying everywhere, where are they going to go? And it seems that the question is almost too narrow, because the risk is actually not about a military base. It's broader than that. And it's much more fluid. And both militaries are working through these dynamics of moving around a lot to avoid, being hit where they are. Dispersal is the new normal.
And that's the huge pushback right now in Papua New Guinea with the American security agreement with the Papua New Guineans and a big public backlash is, what does this bring?
Right.
If we have U.S. military in the country, what else does that bring, particularly if there's a conflict? So it goes back to this old thing about don't militarize the region, and it didn't work out very well for us in World War II, and we're still trying to recover from that. So let's not get ourselves in the middle of a
And it's so tricky for these places because you want your port to be rehabilitated. You want a bigger airport in your island.
Yeah.
And so, but the question is, what are you saying yes to? And what are you, as you're doing that? So
and just invest in it, thanks, but don't bring the military along as well.
Well, let's go to Australia's relations with the Pacific. This year, half of the respondents said that they think Australia's relations with Pacific Island countries are staying the same. Now, we didn't ask about a time period for that, so it's not clear whether they're thinking more near term or over an expanse of time. But Meg, what do you think that tells us about Australian government efforts over many years, in fact, to increase, step up, whatever you want to call it, our relations with the Pacific Island countries?
I love this question because it's a bob every way, right? It's 50% said it's basically the same. 25% said it's getting better, and 25% said it was worse. So you kind of spread the terrain. And when you start to think about it, makes sense. It's like, which side of the elephant are you looking on? If you're looking at our relationship, it looks pretty much the same, right? We're the primary aid donor to the region. We're the primary trade. We're the primary first responder. So that's the same. We spend the most in the Pacific. A lot of things are quite similar. And so that's, I think, what we're seeing. And if we've been a bit complacent, we're back in the game. Those that are saying things are getting better are probably looking at all the hugs and the handshakes as Penny Wong makes her way around the region, 11 countries in in fewer months. And we're getting defense agreements and we're ramping up aid, $900 million over 4 years. So we've got the defense spending going on in there. So people are thinking, look, everybody's smiling. This is going really well for us. And then the other side is going, oh my goodness, the Pacific, it's the most vulnerable place for climate change. They say climate is the biggest threat, and they're not really happy with how we're evolving. And they're looking at everything we've been talking about with China and saying, hang on, they're getting a really big foothold here. We should be concerned about this.
I'm going to come to climate change before we go to questions. But before I do that, Damien, you were covering Secretary Blinken's visit to the Pacific recently. What are your observations from that in terms of how both Australian perceptions of the relations between Australia and the Pacific, and also how the US plays into that picture?
Yeah, I mean, Meg's the expert here. She would probably hear similar things or more than I hear. But for that visit and in other trips that I've made to the Solomons and the Pacific, one of the things that I hear a lot, and you emphasized at the beginning, was the desire for economic help. And I think there's a perception sometimes that Australia is still very condescending in its treatment of the Pacific. And there's a lot of the things that I hear from officials are, we'd really like the Americans to be doing more. We don't want the Americans just to let the Australians run this. And there's a desire for the US to be more present consistently. There's a desire for the US to do more economically, and in some ways to, shake things up a little bit with the Australians. And I think there's a lot of American officials in the Pacific who feel that way too, who frankly feel frustrated with Australia's sense of, hey, this is our turf and don't you worry, we've got this. And so there's actually a little bit of tension in the Pacific between the US and Australia and how this works that hasn't really been sort of explored very much.
Both could do a better job on trade facilitation and opening.
And on climate change and on a lot of these things. I think the Pacific really feels like, gosh, there's a lot of talk and a lot of security, but there's a lot more that we need.
Let's go to climate change. We've seen over the last 5 years a lot of stability in the number of Australians who say that global warming is a pressing issue that needs to be acted on, even if it involves significant costs. Now, Hervé, if I can come to you on this, at the same time, when we had a question about how Australians judge the foreign policy performance of the current government, climate change was right down the bottom of that list. The Albanese government got marked the poorest on its response to climate change. And when we look back at the same question asked of the coalition government in 2021, climate change was also right down the bottom. Is this a issue in terms of an expectations gap between what the public want in terms of action on climate change and what's being delivered? How do you read this?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, it suggests that the threat perception is stable, has stabilized. The big debate perhaps has been settled, although 56% is not quite comfortable enough, I would argue. And within that 56% sits a huge disparity in the way that different age groups see this question. So people younger than 30, I think it's over 70%, is that right, Ryan?
That's right.
See it as a major threat that needs urgent action, including taking economic costs to do that, versus a bare majority, only a bare majority of those over the age of 30 in Australia would see it in the same way. So there is still that age gap. That age gap for other questions that start to narrow, like support for democracy. So it's not always inevitable that there's such a disparity between generations. And by the way, when you're talking plus 30, that's inclusive of millennials. Like that's me basically. I'm a plus 30-year-old.
Well, then you're a worry too.
To clarify, but yeah. So it's odd that age gap hasn't started to reduce as millennials grow older and into that bracket. That's the first thing. But then anyway, whatever it is, the threat perception is more or less stabilized. It's around 56%. There is a majority in favor of seeing this as a major threat that deserves immediate action. So it's a threat perception versus what the government is doing about it. And maybe I think what we're seeing here is when it's ranked bottom for managing Australia's approach to climate change, it's a slightly different angle, right? So it's sort of, what's the threat? We're kind of agreed this is a threat. We're stable on the fact that this is a threat, but we still don't agree the government is doing much or enough to address this threat, at least from Australia's perspective.
I'm going to get some final thoughts from you, Meg, on that. But before I do, I just want you to start thinking about questions. I'm going to open the floor up just after Meg's thoughts on the climate change.
Well, I was shocked at the 56. I mean, how many floods and fires, et cetera, do you need? But I think from a Pacific Island country perspective, I mean, they'd be marking Australia down low as well. I mean, we've got a coal mine approved up in Queensland, another 11 under consideration. We have on the front newspapers today about the proposal going to the International Maritime Organization to actually tax maritime transport. So we raise funds so that we can start this transition. It contributes an enormous amount to emissions, and Australia looks like it may stand in the way of that. We have issues with access to climate finance for these incredibly vulnerable countries. They find it very difficult. Australia is still considering whether it's going to join again. There's a great interpreter piece by our colleagues on the Global Climate Fund. And there is just so much that's frustrating if you're sitting in the Pacific Island countries on the climate change issue, that I think they'd be right there marking the Australians
alongside Saudi Arabia.
Down lower.
That's how the world views
But
Australia.
it suggests there's more continuity on this question than change. I mean, rhetorically, there's been a change, and perhaps this is also it reflects a disappointment because the expectations for Labour were higher than the previous government to act on climate change. And even though they were both rock bottom, ranked rock bottom for climate change, it's just that the expectations were higher. They haven't, perhaps that's been lifted a little bit, but there's still this gap between reality and what's been promised or what people thought was going to be delivered.
It's just a shame there wasn't more pressure coming out of your poll that people wanted action. I thought that was disappointing. If you can fix that up next year.
It's fatigue, I suppose.
Certainly not our role. All right, let's open it up. Could I see any hands if people want to ask questions? Could I just ask you to say who you are and your affiliation, and please keep your questions brief and wait for the microphone.
And introduce yourself if you can.
Georgia.
Thanks, Ryan, and to the panel for a really interesting discussion. Georgia Hammersley from the Lowy Institute. So the poll shows that Australian opinions towards foreign aid spending have really fluctuated between years. And in fact, this year, there's been a significant drop in the number of people in favour of increasing foreign aid spending. So what do you think that these shifting results tell us about the Australian public's willingness to support other countries in need?
Meg, can I start with you on that?
I think it tells you that at the moment there's a lot of economic hardship. And when that happens, there is a tendency to look inward. But I think you have to couple that finding that there is concern about, are we spending too much on aid? But in our own region, I think people are seeing that our relationship, our spending in the Pacific Island countries, but also in some of the areas of Southeast Asia, is in our national interest, that we are part of this region. So there's other statistics that I found fascinating. I can't do them all, but over 80% support, or I think it was over 90 for humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, and playing a role in the region, and over 80% for helping economic development in the region. So I think what you have here is a focus closer on the region, not a rejection of aid, but also people are having a rough time. Cost of living, everything's going up. They've heard these announcements about increases to aid, defense, and I think they're just saying, let's hold, let's do the quality, and let's focus on what matters to us in this region.
And perhaps it's also a case of the general versus the specific.
Yeah.
So we've seen a 7-point fall in the idea of increasing the foreign aid budget. But when we put the specific reasons why we give aid to our region, it's all above 80%. It's as you say.
I think foreign aid is a bad branding name. It's had for a long time. It's been something that many countries just see as just handouts, and so there's not a great understanding of what foreign aid actually does. And I also think that there's an idea that if you look at even how China does it, it's about economic development. Once you change what you're how you're framing it, the whole poll.
Rename it the foreign influence budget.
Exactly.
But I think that's right. I think the previous editions of the poll had also asked Australians whether they thought we spent too much on foreign aid. Inevitably, they always said yes. And then when they were asked about what, say guess multiple choice questions about how much spending,
it was an outsized idea of how much.
They have this sense it's 15% of our GDP or government expenditure, which of course is just a tiny.
It's been politicized and described as waste for far too long. I think that's the misunderstanding.
Okay, other questions from the floor? I see your hands. Sir? If you could wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
Arthur Richardson, I have no affiliation. I'm self-employed. I would just like to ask two questions to the panel. I enjoyed the discussion very much. I think we see two issues with all of this when it involves Australia. One is our concern about American leadership. And does the panel have any real optimism that the turbulence in American politics may somehow decline? And the second question I have to ask you is that Australia is becoming a much more influential country. It's important for many, many reasons in Asia and indeed throughout the world. And I think as a country, we're still a bit schizophrenic about that. I'm not sure that we've really thought what that might involve and what we have to do to make that work. So I'd just like to ask your opinions on those two questions.
Let's start with you, Damien, as our resident American, now naturalized Australian on the panel.
Case where I was actually in Washington last week, so I'm actually coming with a somewhat fresh perspective.
Excellent.
And I was in Congress for Prime Minister Modi's visit, and there was I've been frankly heartbroken by the United States for many years, but I do think that there are elements every once in a while. In this last trip, I did see little bits of hope. I felt like the United States was just starting to come out of its COVID trauma, and I think seeing the sort of enthusiasm of the Indian American population for this visit from the Indian Prime Minister, the United States is such a dynamic place, and it often gets along. And I say this as a frequent critic. It does a better job of getting along more of the time than we sometimes recognize when you just read the news coverage. Those damn journalists. But I do think there are elements of potential hope. That said, it doesn't feel like the fever has broken. And when I asked my colleagues, I had drinks with a couple of the politics editors, and I said, is it as bad as it looks from where I'm sitting on the other side of the world? And they said, yes, if not worse. And so the New York Times is trying to figure out how to cover this campaign in a world that just feels so disrupted, where there are all these systemic issues that aren't going to go away anytime soon. You see it with the Supreme Court decisions. You see it with a lot of the way that the voting rights issues have gone in the past few years. And so while I do think there are sort of seeds of hope, it still feels like the fever hasn't broken. So that's the first thing I would say. On the Australia stuff, I do think I've been here now for 6 years, and I've seen Australia sort of continue to debate what its role wants to be in the world. And I think on one level, yes, it's become more influential and more significant, and that will continue to be the case. On the other hand, I still feel like the conversation about that, to your point, does lag the reality. And for me, the symbol of that, to some degree, was Albanese in San Diego talking about AUKUS and all the jobs it was going to bring. This is like taking this enormous multi-decade strategic decision and enormous bet on Australia's role in the world and reducing it to a few thousand jobs. And so to some degree, Australia is still stuck in this place where it doesn't know what role it wants to play in the world. And sometimes when I tell Australians, when they say, oh, we're just this small country, we're far away from everything, I remind them that the GDP of Australia is roughly equivalent to the GDP of Russia. And so do you think Russians think, oh, maybe we should just shrink back? Not that Australia should copy Russia.
That's a whole other question.
But the thing is, there's so much potential, and Australia has the potential to play a much bigger role in the world, and I think a positive role in the world, if it decides to embrace it and really confront it. But you need the society, you need the political class, you need a whole bunch of people to start to actually really think about what that means. And the Lowy Institute is one of the few places that's at least laying the groundwork for that. But there's a whole lot more development that needs to happen for that to sort of catch up to the role that Australia is playing.
Hervé, can I get your views on how Australia sees itself in the world? Is it commensurate with its actual weight?
Yeah, look, there's and maybe I've been Australian for too long. I used to be an advocate of this bigger Australia. Let's wake up and let's. I think that in some respects, yes, it's true that our GDP is now the size of Russia, although Russia's has regressed. And Russia, if anything, is a case in point of how you can overstretch yourself on the global stage by being too ambitious. Where your sort of military footprint is no longer in line with your economic, what your economy can permit, basically. Now, I think with a growing economy, Australia can permit more, and there's probably an argument to be made that you can have all these things, that you can have your cake and eat it, that you can have AUKUS and generous public welfare. That was a point you made before this discussion. The last government had probably came closest to articulating a global mission for Australia. It's perhaps not everyone agreed with that global mission. It was quite controversial. It was also very bleak. It was rested on this basically unstated assumption. Sometimes it came close to stating it, Prime Minister Morrison, that he felt as if the international order had totally collapsed, that all there was left to do, a bit like in the 1930s, was to arm ourselves, and that it was just hard power, deterrence that was going to prevail, and it wasn't really necessarily inclusive regional architecture. Now, I think this government is sort of not quite sure what it believes, whether it believes in big vision Australia in the way that harks back to previous Labour administrations, or whether it's more incrementalist. And you saw that in the way that Albanese has justified, AUKUS, and they're sort of somewhat stuck, I think, because the last vision was a bolder vision for Australia in the world, but was also very dark and doesn't necessarily subscribe to the worldview. But I think this current government is much more agnostic about the way in which, the direction in which the region and the world is traveling. And therefore, if you're agnostic, you're not sure if war is going to break out or not, you're not sure whether the global economy will continue to integrate or whether it will totally disintegrate, it's harder for you to know what kind of role Australia should be playing. I mean, it's easy to say we should play a bigger role, but what is that role?
But we know that we have to lead in the region, right?
Yeah, but that's the thing. Clear. And I think if you think about the way I sort of think about it is, and the way I describe it sometimes to my American friends is, Australia is like the United States, except it works. And, like you've gotten to a place where you could argue it's a fight between democracy and autocracy. I would argue it's also a fight between governments that work and governments that don't. And Australia has a model that mostly works. Not that there aren't flaws. It's way too secretive. There's all kinds of issues that I have, and now I can say this as that I'm a citizen. But I do think that what you're seeing from countries like Australia and Japan and South Korea and some countries in Europe is a sense that, well, at some point we might have to grab the ball. It may be the case that the United States and China, instead of just letting the sort of geopolitics of great powers dictate to us how the world should work, maybe it's time for many of these moderate middle powers to work together. This is what you see, I think, in the region here. This part of the world, I think, is actually leading the world in that, when you've got the Indias and the Japans and the Koreas, and you've seen the economic growth in this part of the world just skyrocket in the past 20 to 30 years. If there's any place in the world that's actually going to save how the world works, it starts over here. And so for Australia to decide, no, we're just going to be agnostic, I think is abdicating responsibility, I would argue. And I think that Australians have to start to accept the fact that there's a responsibility and a role that comes from being in a place that has accomplished as much as it has, that has as much wealth, and that is in this part of the world.
Well, I think that's a great place to end the discussion. We're out of time. I would like to invite those of you who are able to stay by for a glass of wine and some cheese. We can keep this conversation going. But from my part, let me thank firstly the panelists and ask you to help me thank the panelists for their fantastic discussion today. And also thank you to all of you for your interest in the Lowy Institute Poll. It's always a fascinating discussion, many perspectives. From my perspective, I also want to acknowledge that the whole Institute has been involved in the production of this poll and these events, and a whole range of colleagues have made a huge contribution to making this possible. So thank you to all of them. For now, have a good evening and thank you for your interest.